Welcome to Well Traveled Life. Today we are on a Fab4 private taxi tour to see Beatles sites around the city of Liverpool. We're going to give you the inside stories and show you the sites as we saw them. We'll take you to iconic sites and show you the places where things started for each of the members of this band. Our tour began at Prince's Dock. Steve, our driver, picked us up in a minivan. We had two seats facing each other, so there were four of us in the car, very comfortably fitting. He even had a stool to help us get out. We're going to take you on the driving part of our tour so that you really see the whole of the city as we go. And we're going to start out by talking just a little bit about the changes we've seen in the city since we first started coming decades ago. We were on our cruise a year ago that stopped here in Liverpool. We spent a day and we came back this year for a week because we loved it so much.
Liverpool has been my favorite stop.
Is it because of the Beatles?
I would say the Beatles are part of it, but even if there weren't Beatles here, I would feel the same way about it.
In fact, the city really is so magnificent. We think you should do a tour of the city as well, and we have a video about that. It's also on this Well Traveled Life channel, and we'll link to it. But give the entire city a shot. This one, though, let's focus on Beatles. After all, you can't come to Liverpool and not follow in the footsteps of the greatest band in history. But forget the big crowded buses. That's an option, and that is one of the tours we'll take you on in a different video. But we think that the best way to peel back the layers of the Fab Four story in one of these, a classic Liverpool black cab. This is a private tour just for the four of us. This is the FAb4 Taxi Tour, and it's more than just a ride. It's like your personal journey through the streets that forged the legends. Our driver, Steve, is a true Scouser. He's a local and a Beatles historian, and he's got a little bit of a story of his own. Watch for that at the end. It's kind of fun. He is about to take us deep into the heart of the childhood of each one of these iconic men. The magic always starts at home, and we'll start here. Taxi weaves into the South Liverpool district. The story shifts to the most grounded of the four, Richard Starkey Jr., or as the world knows him, Ringo Starr. Ringo's neighborhood was called the Dingle. We'll go to 9 Madron Street, his birthplace, and life here was tough. Ringo's father, Richard Sr., left when Ringo was just 3 years old, and he left Ringo's mother, the indomitable Elsie Starkey, to work tirelessly. She took double shifts as a barmaid and a cleaner to keep a roof over their heads. It was a chaotic but loving environment. Frequent and severe illnesses, including a burst appendix and ensuing peritonitis. Ringo was hospitalized for years during his childhood. At age 6, he was nearly pronounced dead. He contracted tuberculosis at age 13 and again was sent to a sanatorium. During his sickness, he missed so much school. His neighbor, Elsie, became his tutor, babysitter, and surrogate sister. We're at number 9 Madron Street, and this is the home where Ringo Starr was actually born. That window up there, the birthing place. He only lived here as a small child, so he doesn't have a lot of memories here. There's another house down the street, around the corner, where he actually grew up. But this is where it all began for Ringo Starr. I think a funny thing, check out, there is no window lintel here, and it's because when fans heard that this might be demolished, they came out, crashed it up, and took pieces of history with them. It's been left without its lintel. The other windows all still have them. Look directly across the street, and you will see what the neighbor has done with the grout between the bricks. Stability in Ringo's life finally arrived in 1953 when Elsie married a cheerful dockworker named Harry Graves. Harry was the great stabilizer. He was a kind stepfather who saw the creativity in young Richie. And crucially, when Ringo showed an interest in the drums, Harry was the one who encouraged it. He helped to buy his first proper kit. It wasn't John's intellectual rebellion or Paul's natural talent that fueled Ringo's start. It was the hard-working love of his mother, the stability of his new stepfather, and the resilience he gained on these very streets. The Dingle made Ringo the heart of the Beatles, and that heart started right here on Admiral Grove. When asked to create a a album of nostalgic songs, both John and Paul turned to the Liverpool of their youth. We'll now head out to the suburbs and take a look at some of those places that inspired some of the most recognizable and meaningful songs for most people. Few places in the city are as instantly recognizable thanks to that song Penny Lane. This isn't just a street name, it's a living, breathing landscape painted vividly by Paul's lyrics. As we drive through the bustling junction, you can almost hear the familiar melody. Every detail that he has described, every character that he imagined, was inspired by the everyday scenes that he and John would observe right there waiting for buses. There's the shelter in the middle of the roundabout, which is now a bus stop, and just across the way you'll find the building that inspired the barber showing photographs. It's incredible to think that these mundane suburban details, seen through the eyes of two young lads, would transform into one of the most beloved and evocative pop songs of all time. Beth Davidson was the inspiration for the lyrics in the song about the nurse selling poppies. This harkens back to post-war Liverpool. John would have known Beth, and she actually ended up marrying Pete Shotton, who was John's best friend and one of the original members of the Quarrymen. Beth died from breast cancer very early in the 1970s, and that begins another theme that plays strongly through the Beatles' lives. The Penny Lane sign is obviously an iconic part of this whole trip, and people flock to this street just to get pictures of the sign. In fact, it's been so coveted that the sign has been destroyed or stolen so many times that it's now actually painted on the brick wall, and they've had to cover it in plastic just to keep it safe. But you can still walk up to it and see it and touch it. And of course, there are the regular street signs that you can get to as well. Continuing on to the famous junction with the bus stop, we'll see that the shelter has since changed. It's become a restaurant called Sgt. Pepper's Bistro. That later closed, but the image remains powerful. It anchors the song to a specific point in time, showing how the ordinary, quiet moments of Liverpool life, even a simple nurse collecting for charity, were observed and immortalized by the Fab Four. With the bus stop in the background, the barbershop across the street, and the bank on the corner, the John Lennon Imagine statue stands at the foot of St. Barnabas Church, placed there in 2002 to continue his mission for peace. Paul's genius was in capturing this snapshot of his childhood, elevating the ordinary to the extraordinary. Penny Lane isn't just a place in Liverpool, it's a timeless postcard from the Beatles' memory, brought vibrantly to life by the music. It's a song you don't just hear, you see it. And standing here, you can actually feel it.
We were having the time of our lives when we started. Everything was groovy, but I'm noticing lately we've been half-hearted. West Side Story don't feel pretty anymore.
Things change over time, and so what was the barbershop on Penny Lane has sadly gone out of business and may become a bar. Who knows, maybe a bar and barbershop. The bank is just down the street, and while it was the bank where there was an account for probably Paul's family, it is now a doctor's surgery. But that would be the banker without the Macintosh suit, walking down to the barbershop, etc. We're also right here at the bus roundabout. Bus roundabout has been closed for quite some time, but has a wonderful story. Beth Davis was the young maid in the dress selling poppies, and that really was a true person built on Beth Davis, who ended up marrying John's very best friend, and sadly continues that breast cancer story that we got from Ringo's mom, and died at the young age of 35 of breast cancer, but is remembered and memorialized in that song. We're now going to go to number 9 Newcastle Road in the Wavertree suburb of Liverpool. This house is just around the corner and down the street from Penny Lane. John Lennon lived in this home for the first 5 years of his life. His grandparents lived here, as did his mother, Julia, and this is where he lived with her for those very early years. Ask me about number 9 and John Lennon. This is his childhood home, and it is number 9. In 2013, the house was sold at auction. It was asking £150,000, and it sold for nearly £500,000. There's no public record of who purchased it, but there's a wide belief that the New York resident who purchased it is none other than
Yoko. Yoko.
In contrast to the others, George Harrison was born into a 2-up, 2-down terraced house at 12 Arnold Grove, also in Wavertree. It was a humble working-class Liverpool, small rooms, an outdoor toilet, and heat from just one coal fire. This was George's world for the first 6 years of his life. The family later moved to Speke, where George would eventually meet Paul sitting on a bus going to the Liverpool Institute, but the true foundation of his Beatle destiny lay with his mom, Louise Harrison. Louise was an exceptionally supportive mom. When George was still a boy, he first became obsessed with the guitar. She didn't dismiss it as a phase. She recognized that music made him happy, and that was all she wanted for her children. She even helped him buy his very first cheap acoustic guitar. This support continued as the Beatles grew. Louise and George's father, Harold, famously tolerated endless, loud band rehearsals in their small living room at 25 Upton Green. And when Beatlemania hit, Louise handled mounds of fan mail, corresponding with fans and nurturing the connection that George had with his audience. Often considered the quiet Beatle, he was actually anything but. He was the one whose passion for music was cultivated, encouraged, and protected by that unwavering faith of his Liverpudlian mum. The house is now privately owned, and so it is no longer on any of the Liverpool Beatles tours. In order to get there, you would need to park somewhere outside of the neighborhood and walk in to see the house. George's first home does have a historic blue plaque, which is awarded through a process of public nomination to either English Heritage or Historic England. Candidates must have been deceased for at least 20 years, and the building must be recognizable and visible part of the public highway, with special recognition that's given to those who've made a significant contribution to society. We're now moving on to another suburb of Liverpool, Allerton. And here at 20 Forthlin Road, we're going to find the heart of Paul McCartney's musical youth. This modest, semi-detached council house is what the National Trust rightly calls the birthplace of the Beatles. This is where the McCartney family moved in 1955. It wasn't fancy, just a simple, ordinary home, but it was here, in the small living room and front parlor, that Paul and John Lennon would spend countless hours writing their earliest hits. Imagine the scene. 2 teenagers huddled over guitars, skipping school to craft melodies that would soon define an entire generation. Songs like I Saw Her Standing There and Love Me Do were first hammered out on an acoustic guitar right here, perhaps leaning against the fireplace or even out on the back porch. Paul's father, Jim McCartney, a working musician himself, not only encouraged their work, but he also offered gentle early criticism, ensuring that they strove for excellence. So more than just a house, 20 Forthlin Road is a monument to their commitment. It's where the discipline, the partnership, and the unique sound of Lennon McCartney were truly forged, turning suburban living into rock and roll history. To fully understand Paul, though, we must remember the quiet, profound influence of his mother, Mary McCartney. She was a nurse and a midwife known for her gentle strength and dedication. But tragically, when Paul was just 14, Mary died suddenly from complications following a mastectomy, which she had because she also had breast cancer. It was a shattering loss that marked Paul deeply, throwing his life into emotional turmoil. This devastating loss created an immediate, deep bond between Paul and John, who would lose his mother, Julia, just a few years later. They found mutual comfort and shared grief, a profound connection that fueled their partnership. And years later, that sorrow would inspire one of the Beatles' greatest songs. Paul has said that the idea for Let It Be came to him in a dream about his mother, where she offered him comfort during a dark time. The lyric, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be, is a direct and tender tribute to her calming spirit. Mary's legacy is woven into the heart of the Beatles' music, not just in the melody, but in the wisdom and hope that she continues to impart. The home is now operated as a museum by the National Trust. Tickets cost £36 for entrance. If you are a National Trust member, they are only £12. It is recommended that you book in advance because they limit space to just 15 people per tour. Importantly, you cannot just show up at the house to get on a tour. The tours go on designated minibuses that pick up in Liverpool. There are 2 pickup locations, one at Speke Hall and the other one in Liverpool. At the Liverpool South Parkway train station, there is a tour at 10:05 in the morning and 10:45 in the morning that will depart from the bus stand at the Liverpool train station, and then the ones at 1:30 in the afternoon and 2:10 in the afternoon are the ones that leave from Speke Hall. This tour will take you to both John's and Paul's homes, but there's a couple of caveats. You can buy a guidebook if you would like, but you must book that online. They will not sell the guidebooks to you on the tour. They'll have it ready for you at the house. Also, you cannot take any photographs inside either of the homes. Those are considered copyright infringements, so no cameras. Also not allowed pets, food, or drink inside the houses. At Paul's house, remember, Jim was bringing up Paul and his brother Mike alone. The McCartney men weren't very house proud, and so you may expect to see mismatched wallpaper, some clutter, and even threadbare sofas. So Paul's house, original house, is a grade 2 listed building, and it's a historic structure. How do you update a historic structure and try and make it look as much like its original? Well, you go to the neighbors who were replacing their windows and say, can we please borrow your windows? And we'll go ahead and put them in the house over here. So these are original windows, not from this house, but from the house across the street. But it's what was out those back windows that made Mary love the house.
When she moved in, she said, this is my final home. I'm not moving on again from here. And the reason for that is at the back of the house is a police training field where they train police horses, police dogs. So when she'd open the bedroom window of a morning, she'd look out and she'd see horses grazing. And it was just like living in the countryside. Unfortunately, 6 months later, she died of breast cancer. So
Common.
very, very sad.
Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be.
We'll now head to the substantial middle-class home at 251 Menlove Avenue, known as Mendips. This is where John Lennon spent most of his childhood, but his life was shaped by a complicated family dynamic involving 2 very powerful women. When John was just 5, his mother's older sister made claims to Child Protective Services that he was not in a safe environment. When she was awarded custody, John was primarily raised by his aunt Mimi Smith and her husband George. Mimi provided the stability and the proper environment. She was strict, she was firm, and she insisted on John getting a good education, constantly telling him, "The guitar is all very well, John, but you'll never earn a living from it." However, just a few streets away lived his mother, Julia. Julia was John's creative and spiritual touchstone. She was spontaneous, musical, and introduced him to the electric sounds of rock and roll. She gifted him his first guitar, and she taught him to play the banjo, directly encouraging the exact musical path that Mimi has discouraged. So John lived this double life, the rigid rules of Mendips and the bohemian freedom of Julia's house. This emotional tug-of-war formed the foundation of his personality and his music, the dreamer and the rebel. The tension between the 2 sisters was real. On July 15th, just months before John's 18th birthday, Julia was visiting her sister Mimi, and there probably were difficult conversations as Julia wanted John to come back and live with her again. As she left the house, she was crossing the street to get to a bus stop, and was hit by a car. There was speculation that the driver had been drinking. He was actually an off-duty police officer who claimed that Julia had stepped out in front of him and the accident could not have been avoided. The official verdict of the inquest was death by misadventure. That tragic loss cemented John's deep-seated trauma and fueled his songwriting for years. Mendips is more than a house. It's a place where John Lennon learned about love, loss, and the conflicting forces that ultimately inspired the world's greatest rock poet. John enjoyed a warm relationship with his Uncle George and maintained contact with his Aunt Mimi throughout his life. In fact, his final conversation with her was the day before he was killed, when he talked about coming back to the UK. We're now headed to St. Peter's Church in Woolton. This peaceful suburban setting is arguably the most important place in rock and roll history. Not only had John sung in the choir at the church, but it was here on July 6th of 1957 that the annual St. Peter's Church Garden Fete was held. 16-year-old John Lennon and his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, were booked to play on a makeshift stage in the field behind the church hall. During a break between sets, John was introduced to a 15-year-old school friend of a bandmate, Paul McCartney. Paul famously impressed John by playing rock and roll classics like Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock and crucially showing John how to properly tune his guitar. That meeting, right here in this humble church hall, changed everything. As John would later say, that was the day I met Paul, that it started moving. Paul had befriended George Harrison because they both rode a bus together. And he eventually arranged for an audition for Harrison with John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, and that was in 1958 as well. Although Lennon initially thought Harrison was too young, he was only 15 at the time, he was definitely impressed by Harrison's guitar playing, and after a second meeting, Harrison became the band's lead guitarist. But that was only because somebody else wasn't available and Harris was the stand-in. The group went through several name changes and even some lineup shifts, but eventually settled on the name The Beatles in August of 1960. But it was here in the church and in the cemetery across the street that John called the Bone Orchard, where the collaboration began at that infamous garden fete. If this is hallowed ground for Beatles fans, what's across the street may be even more vital. In the churchyard, you can find a quiet link to another Beatles masterpiece, Eleanor Rigby. While Paul insists that the name came to him randomly, fans flock here to see the actual tombstone of an Eleanor Rigby. Paul later admitted that the name may have been subconsciously remembered from the countless times he and John cut through the cemetery. And just steps away lies the grave of a John Mackenzie. Coincidence? Inspiration? We'll never know for sure, but the very real names of the lonely people immortalized in one of the Beatles' most famous songs are right here, standing as silent testament to the genius sparked on this very spot. A short distance from Mendips, just past the church fete, we arrive at the famous Red Gates of Strawberry Fields. The site was not John Lennon's home, but instead an orphanage run by the Salvation Army. As a boy living with his Aunt Mimi, John would often sneak over the wall and play on the wooded grounds during the children's summer fetes. It was his personal sanctuary, a place where he could escape the pressures of his complicated home life and retreat into his imagination. The innocence, fantasy, and melancholy of this place became the foundation for one of the Beatles' greatest and most groundbreaking songs, Strawberry Fields Forever. He used the song to recall those lonely but magical childhood memories, contrasting the rigid structure of his life with the whimsical freedom that he found there. The famous complex lyric, "Nothing to Get Hung About," perfectly captures the bittersweet feeling of a safe childhood haven, but it has another, more personal meaning. It's a direct reference to a story from his childhood. Aunt Mimi would tell him not to play at Strawberry Fields, the children's home near their home, warning that he might get in trouble. And Lennon's reply was that they can't hang you for it, playing on the literal meaning of the word hung or hanged. Today, those iconic gates stand as a permanent memorial to John, but the site continues its original mission. The gates now welcome visitors, and the center provides vocational training and support for young people with learning difficulties. It remains a place of refuge, imagination, and hope, just as it was for the young boy who found inspiration here and then shared that dream with the world. And if you're at Strawberry Fields, there's a little something hidden in the corner. What a story. These are the original gates, because these were stolen from the front of the property where they originally stood. And they were found at a scrap metal place, and the gentleman there said, "Hey, I got them not knowing, but I think I have your gates." And he returned them. They were put up here and now stand as a testament to Strawberry Fields and the legacy that this place has with the Salvation Army, not just Lennon's song, but with the Salvation Army and the Works program that has operated here. This was originally an orphanage, and when the original mansion burned down in an electrical fire, it was rebuilt with kind of a nondescript know-nothing building. And then in the 2000s, it was replaced with this new work center, which also serves as a visitor center to Strawberry Fields. Getting those gates back was an absolute caper. There had been a local search and then a national search, and it was through the goodness of somebody who had come into possession of them that they got returned. As you go through the prayer area at Strawberry Fields, you will find the lyrics that make this place feel special and give you a deeper understanding of what Lennon was trying to accomplish here on this earth with music and song. It is a message of imagination, peace, creativity, togetherness, and maybe answers some of those difficult questions from his childhood about how we value each other. You tell me, do you see the similarities between this original mansion that was here in Strawberry Fields that served as the orphanage and the architecture of the Dakota where John chose to live in New York? I see similarities. As we headed back to town, we did a little singing and a little storytelling.
Come tend the garden with me. We have so many seeds to sow. When the harvest comes in, it will be time to share what we have grown. We were having...
Every Scouser has a story, and every real Scouser has a real Beatles story. Our guide Steve shared with us on the drive back into the city his story about his close connection to the Beatles. Steve didn't hear this story until he was an adult, but it made quite an impression, especially for his Beatle-loving wife. His Uncle Tommy was the first drummer for the professional Beatles. Back then they were the Silver Beatles, spelled Beetles, and he was replaced by Pete Best, and here's the story of how that took place.
This was 2 months before the first Hamburg tour. So they went up to Scotland and they had a crash in the van. And Uncle Tommy was hit in the face with all his drum equipment. And put him in hospital. It knocked out all his front teeth.
Oh, wow.
But because of being a professional contract, they had to be 4 guitarists and a drummer. So John Lennon went to the hospital and dragged Tommy out of it to carry on with the tour. So he completed the tour. Tommy had a bashed up face, returned to Liverpool, and Tommy got fed up and decided to leave the band. So the Beatles went round to my Auntie Mira's house, knocking on the door, looking for Tommy. And my auntie leaned out the window, and this is actually on Wikipedia. They said, "We need Tommy to play for us tonight." And she said, and I quote, "Piss off, he's going back to his old job in the bottle factory. He won't be playing for you anymore." So sent them on the way.
So there you have it. Uncle Tommy has a car accident, gets knocked in the face, put in the hospital, and the Beatles come to him saying, we've got to complete the contract. And he says, nope, I'm out. But how do we know this isn't just family lore? Well, Steve's got an answer for that, too. In 1992, Uncle Tommy's mom, Steve's Auntie Vera, tells the following story.
And then my granddad started going on the fact that they used to come round over weekend. They moved all the furniture out the living room into the kitchen so they could practice. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you mean the Beatles have actually played in this living room? He went, yeah. I went, oh my God, how come I never knew this? So I was blown away. My wife was a little bit skeptical, but I was like, wow.
So imagine Steve's surprise to find that the Beatles had been playing in his nan and granddad's house and the whole opportunity was lost. But again, how do you verify it? There's more.
10 or 15 years ago, we had this festival in Liverpool called the Matthew Street Festival. It was where bands from all over the world would come and celebrate the Beatles playing in all the pubs and the clubs on August Bank Holiday weekend. And I was working as a normal taxi driver one of these weekends, and I picked up a couple and we're talking about the Beatles, and I told them my story. And the girl said to me, oh, the Beatles used to play in a house by my granddad's as well. I said, oh, where did your granddad live? She said, Winfield Road in Garston. I went, that's where my granddad lives. So a random stranger confirmed to me that the Beatles played in the same road as my nan and granddad. So
wow.
It had to be Tommy.
So there you have it. Early Beatles history took place right there in Steve's nan and granddad's living room. But what happened to Uncle Tommy, you ask? Well, here's the rest of that story.
He died in 1980 of a brain hemorrhage.
Oh.
And our Helen, his eldest daughter, my cousin, who I'm still in contact with, she says to people the reason why he died of a brain hemorrhage is because John Lennon kept hitting him over the head with his drumsticks. I don't think that part of the story is actually true, though.
From the Quarrymen to the Silver Beatles to the Beatles, there have been a lot of name changes, and here's another interesting bit of trivia that explains one of those name changes. So those spelling changes may have just been a confusion about the way that they were using the word Beatles, but in Hamburg there was a more definitive reason for the change in spelling.
And then when they went to Hamburg a couple of months later with Pete Best, they couldn't call themselves, I don't know what the actual word is, but I believe they had to change the name from the Beatles temporarily to the Beat Brothers, because Beatles in Germany is the name for male genitalia. So they didn't want to be referred to as a group of
dicks.
You know.
Well, Hamburg is where things got big, so somehow the name went back to the Beatles, despite its misnomer.
But in Scotland, as I say, he went up there as the Silver Beatles, and I believe some places when you were advertising them actually changed the word Beatles to an EA instead of an EEE. So they were getting advertised as the Silver Beatles with an EA, and they believe that that was like the transition period between being the Silver Beatles and the Beatles.
Our FAb4 Taxi Tour was more than a sightseeing trip. It was a personal history lesson, taking us beyond the museums, into the very suburbs, the living rooms, and the streets where four local lads changed the world forever. Our driver, Steve, was part of the magic of this tour. He had great stories. He was personable, friendly, really easy to get along with. The car was so much fun, reliable, and really great to be in the Liverpool black taxi cab. We were comfortable. He picked us up where we were staying. He dropped us off at the Beatles Story Experience, which we had tickets for and were able to get into. We have a video about that, and we'd love for you to see it if you want to continue the Beatles story and see it from a little bit different perspective, all in one space instead of around the city. What we didn't cover on this tour is Matthew Street and the Cavern Club. That is part of the Liverpool City tour, and you can do that either by bus, but we would suggest go on foot. A million thanks to Steve. This is his list of must-watches and must-reads. We've left a link to him in our description. Reach him directly for your tour in the description, and we leave you with Beatles music and a lot of love.